No, so my presentation this morning is on some lessons that I've learned while doing a multi-center surgical trial back when I was a surgical trainee. So just to give some context, I was a junior surgical trainee in University Hospital Limerick from 2010 until 2012. And after I completed my basic surgical training, I planned to do a period of full-time research. And my preference was for clinical research rather than laboratory research. And I was very, very inexperienced at that time. But nonetheless, I set some goals for myself. Firstly, I wanted to achieve a higher degree by research. Then I wanted to learn to publish. I wanted to have a clinically meaningful effect, ideally, and I wanted to stay clinically orientated as well. And I was very lucky at the time that I'd worked with Professor Stuart Walsh clinically. And it was fantastic that Prof. Walsh agreed to act as a mentor for me and as a clinical supervisor for the research. And I can't understate the importance of having a good mentor. And I benefited enormously in this regard because Professor Walsh has got a very, very good track record. He was widely published and he had a good deal of experience as well at doing clinical trials. So just to summarize, the trial that I was involved with was on the use of remote ischemic preconditioning in major vascular surgery. This remote preconditioning is not a well-known concept, and for anybody who's unfamiliar, it refers to the idea that brief periods of ischemia and reperfusion in a part of the body can induce a protective state elsewhere in the body. So many of the studies that on this topic would have used brief arm or leg ischemia induced by repeated inflations and deflations of the blood pressure cuff. That was the stimulus, and the idea would be that this could induce a cardioprotective state to protect the heart later during procedures. So it sounds strange, it sounds counterintuitive, but this intervention is very, very attractive because we do need ways of protecting the heart, especially during high-risk procedures such as cardiac surgery, such as vascular surgery. And furthermore, this intervention has a very, very benign risk profile and is very cheap. So there had been a few trials before in vascular, but we knew that a larger trial was needed. One further point here actually is that remote preconditioning, this whole topic is a very, very fruitful academic field. There's been considerable interest in it in the last 20 plus years, and there's an ongoing steady stream of publications coming out in the literature. So this really, really did suit my goal of having an important and clinically relevant subject matter to deal with. And a quick word of advice for any future trialists out there listening today would be that if possible, try to focus your research on something that's exciting, something that's topical, because you'll want people to be interested. You'll want it to be appealing when it comes to looking for funding, and you'll want it to be published easily as well. So ideally do pick something that's topical, that's exciting. And for me, this fitted the bill. So it was a multi-center trial that took place across 3 vascular surgery centres. These were University Hospital Limerick, Cork University Hospital, and University Hospital Waterford. And the idea behind the trial was that we wanted to see if remote preconditioning done just before vascular surgery could protect the patients from a variety of different post-operative complications. Now, I didn't know much about remote preconditioning at the time, nor did I know a great deal about clinical trials. So I was very reliant upon my supervisor for many aspects of how the trial was designed. Now, I did know one thing. I knew that if we could include a couple of other centres, we'd be able to increase our recruitment a good deal, and we'd also be able to enhance external validity. And we were very, very lucky in this regard that we have close colleagues in Cork and in Waterford who we were on very good terms with, the consultants there. And luckily, the senior registrars in those institutions during those years had all just recently passed through Limerick. So again, we had very, very good interpersonal relationships with them. And so Professor Walsh and I paid a visit to those sites before the trial began, and we were very glad that the people there were very, very interested in what we were proposing and very, very excited to be involved. I think this was a major advantage for our trial. So moving along, ethical approval was a major challenge as well. This required a great deal of teamwork too, and it was spearheaded largely by a colleague of ours in University Hospital Limerick called Dr. Mary Clark Maloney. So she really drove the application for ethical approval across the 3 sites, and it took a good deal of work. And then once the trial was running, I based myself on a full-time basis in University Hospital Limerick, where I spent my time recruiting patients, randomizing them, applying the intervention, and assessing outcomes. So it was considerably time consuming, but I found that once the ball got rolling, recruitment was reasonably steady. Now, unfortunately, we had no funding for this trial, so we were relying heavily upon the goodwill of our colleagues in Cork and Waterford. In particular, we needed a considerable amount of goodwill from the registrars at those centres because they were already busy enough with their clinical work. And now we were asking them to get involved in recruiting, randomizing, and then applying an intervention that took over half an hour before their operations. So it was quite a big ask, and we were very grateful to them for their assistance with it. Now, throughout the course of the trial, Professor Walsh and I stayed in close contact with those surgical teams in those other hospitals, and we paid a few visits so that we'd stay in touch. Now, just moving along, there's a couple of other aspects of the design of the trial that I think are worth highlighting in this meeting. So the intervention that we chose was a procedure, remote preconditioning. And this was great because there is a great deal of regulatory difficulties and logistical difficulties that would go with, for example, a trial evaluating a drug product. And then furthermore, our intervention, as I mentioned earlier, has a very, very safe side effect profile and was very, very cheap. And I think that this was ideal. And I'd like to highlight to anybody listening that procedural trials, particularly ones that have a safe and benign risk factor profile, are far, far easier to do than, say, for example, a drug trial. One other aspect that I thought worked really, really well was that we kept the care of our included patients as close to normal care as possible. I think Tom mentioned this earlier in his slide. And in the case of the trial that I was involved with, the only extra thing that we really needed was a couple of extra blood tests on the first 3 post-operative days and 1 extra ECG. And aside from that, patients received the usual standard care. There was no extra visits required. I think this was very, very beneficial because it reduced the burden on the patients. And maybe equally, or maybe even more importantly, it reduced the burden on our colleagues at those other sites, particularly when the trial was unfunded and we were relying heavily on their goodwill. Now, so this trial, in terms of recruitment, it ran for 27 months, from early 2012 until 2014, midway through. And we were able to recruit 200 patients. And I think that this, at the time at least, made it one of the largest multi-center trials and surgery that were ever done in Ireland. So I was quite proud of the achievement that we did. And we were able to show that multi-center collaboration and this kind of an unfunded surgical trial was feasible. And we were able to show that it was feasible to use the remote ischemic preconditioning intervention in this high-risk vascular subgroup of patients. And furthermore, we were able to show that it could be done without hindering clinical practice and that patients didn't mind. Unfortunately, when it came to clinical outcomes, we didn't find a difference between the 2 groups. But nonetheless, the work that we did was very, very helpful in regards to informing the design of a larger funded trial on this same subject matter that followed some years later. So just a couple more lessons here. I certainly started out doing this with a considerable degree of anxiety because I was inexperienced and I wasn't sure if it would work out or if I was wasting my time and all that. And looking back on it, there's definitely a few lessons that I'd like to highlight that I learned during the course of the trial. So firstly, I was struck by how interested patients were in taking part. So all in all, we approached 231 patients to assess them for eligibility. And I was amazed to see that only 8 patients were excluded because they didn't give consent. So what I take from that is that patients are extraordinarily keen to be involved in research. And I remember a couple of patients who were so interested in this that I would have 20-minute, half an hour plus discussions with them about the science behind remote preconditioning and about biology and about the mechanism of action. And this would happen again and again when I'd meet the patient for follow-up. So I think that if anybody's watching here is planning a trial, you can be assured that the patients will be interested. In the same way, I was not so sure at the beginning how interested my colleagues would be. And I knew in particular that we would need, fantastic support from our colleagues in theatre, for example, from nursing staff members, from anaesthetic colleagues, and also from the surgical teams. I have to admit that when the trial began, at least in the Limerick Centre, where I was based, I encountered a little bit of resistance at the beginning because it does, I guess, hinder the onset of a procedure because if a patient requires the preconditioning intervention, it can delay the case for maybe 20, 25 minutes, whatever. So I did encounter a little bit of resistance at the beginning, but after a few months, once everybody knew what I was doing, I found people to be very, very supportive and very enthusiastic about it. And I became just a regular member of the clinical team in theatre after a very, very short period. So again, anybody planning a clinical trial out there, like Tom said earlier, I think you can be pretty confident that your colleagues will be very, very supportive of this. So the most important lesson that I learned was in regards to the third point here, teamwork. And in particular, I learned that a functional team can have a synergistic effect, and you can really, really get a lot of work done when people work together. In regards to this trial, every single aspect of it required collaboration, from the design of the trial to getting our colleagues on board in Cork and in Waterford, and to keeping them on board, and to getting ethical approval, to relying heavily upon this continual goodwill from our colleagues in Waterford and Cork, especially when we had no funding for the trial. So I think it was really amazing. I often wondered why so many people went along with us. And I think upon reflection, that is probably because the idea was very, very attractive. It was plausible at a biological level, and it was plausible also at a practical level. And I think that people felt that they were being asked to help in something that was ambitious, and that they wanted it to succeed. And as a minor point as well, we promised everybody who was helping us that they'd get their names as co-authors in the final published paper. So I think that helped as well. And finally, at a personal level, all in all, this work made me become very, very patient. It took 28 months from the start of recruitment until the end of the data collection. And at times, I do remember it being very, very tedious. There were periods where recruitment seems to have stalled, but thankfully it would always pick back up again. And definitely there was a period at the beginning where I was unsure if it would ultimately work out, but certainly after a few months, it was clear that it would. So anybody out there planning a trial, just be aware of this. And I think that it's good if you can prepare yourself by trying to encourage yourself to have a good deal of patience, particularly when you're beginning a trial. So this is the last slide here. This slide is a screenshot of the final published article from 2015 Vascular and Endovascular Surgery journal. And look at all the names there. You can see just what level of collaboration was needed to get this work over the line. And I think that my main message here is that this kind of multi-center collaborative research work can work very, very well as long as there's a good plan and good teamwork, even if there's no funding. And my lack of experience of this kind of work didn't stop me from doing my role, because guidance and experience was available in abundance from elsewhere. And I'd like to take the opportunity now to encourage trainees to go down the route of doing randomized controlled trials, because they're eminently doable and very, very rewarding. And thank you again to the RCSI, to the HRB Trials Methodology Group, and to Professor Walsh, and to all the attendees.